Hey, good evening, Bob. How are you doing?
Doing great, Jay. It's a lovely day and evening in Southern California.
I hear you. It's about perfect weather here in Austin as well. So definitely enjoying this time of the year. And speaking of enjoying, I really enjoyed our conversation last week where we dug into some of the tough topics that you're going to go further on when we do the Red Thread House in conjunction with the Association of United States Army's National Convention in just 2 short weeks. And I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into some of the topics we explored. But before I do so, I just want to really foot stomp the incredible panels we're going to have at AUSA here on October 14th. We're going to look at contested logistics, command and control. We're going to look at some of the technology that's going to support health and holistic fitness for our service members. You've already talked about the deep dive you're going to do in the ethics of AI and robotics and future conflict. We're also going to look at some small businesses that are early stage that have critical technologies that really represent the resurgence of the arsenal of democracy as we look towards the production capacity we're going to need domestically in order to meet requirements for future conflict. And then lastly, we've got a company with NATO and French contracts with their Ministry of Defense that's going to look at some of the technologies they use to increase the accountability and accuracy of AI driven decisions, where you can no longer operate with a hallucination or some of the incorrect data and outputs that you may get from an AI model. So it's going to be a really exciting run of show. And I really can't thank you enough for everything you've done to help us put this together with these incredible panels. That said, we talked last week about the concept of how a kill chain could be analogous to a protect chain as well. And I'd like to revisit really quickly the elements that I personally map out when I look at a strike chain or a kinetic kill chain. And I want to foot stomp that this is not linear. So it's not truly a chain where everything is explicitly linked step to step. It's more of a web in some of the more current technology that we're seeing applied right now. But the steps or the elements of this web that I personally map out are either a sense or a detect, because in some respects, it may not be physically collecting a parameter like a thermal image or an electromagnetic signature. It might simply be some data that helps us understand that there's some activity occurring in a particular place. So there's that sensor detect stage. That's going to feed a process stage where you aggregate the data, you're able to make sense of it, and then understand what is occurring at the place or places of interest. The next step in my mind is a select phase where you're going to make a decision, data driven, informed by some level of automation, most likely in future conflict. And that selection process is going to be, what do you want to do about the situation that's evolving, that you're getting this data that's informing and that you've processed? So you may select to take an action like a kinetic strike. You may select to do nothing. You may select to maintain target custody or something like that. The next step in my mind is an effect stage, because it may be a kinetic or lethal effect. It may be a non-kinetic effect. And then lastly, there's an assessment phase where you can create the cycle to then come back to, have I achieved an outcome I sought, not only against the larger battlefield framework, but also against that particular target for which you had custody. And I would argue that that process is absolutely analogous to what we need to do to protect forces or facilities as well. But I'd like to get your thoughts on A, that framework, because that just happens to be the one I use when I'm doing various scenarios. And then B, how that's applicable for both strike and protect using the JFC Fuller model.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty agnostic to the acronym I like to use in targeting, right? I think you're spot on in describing what is essentially the process that goes into what we call a kill chain. What, folks that have grown up in the army or in joint operations understand when they say kill chain, right? It's this process of getting a some having a system that connects with the world in a real way so that it can sense and understand the world around it, and then process that information towards a decision, and making the kinds of decisions that you talked about, especially like when we talked about last time. I'm deeply impressed by what I think are essentially very fungible systems, right? If I have the process that allows me to close a kill chain to a kinetic effect against an enemy system, i- it's essentially the same technology and the same process that closes a protect chain with that seeks to have some sort of effect on the enemy's system that's coming in to to strike a value that I care about. And so in that sense, I think you're spot on. And one of the things I like the most about what you just said is it starts with this problem of sensing, right? Of being able to take up the data that starts the process. And I think this is a really, really important problem. And I've sat now through the process of getting ready for Red Thread House in conjunction with AUSA. I've sat through Rune AI's panel on contested logistics. We talked about it this morning with their team. We've sat through the C2 panel with Dunedane and Productable and SMAC technologies. Uh, and the thread that's starting to emerge for me, and what we'll talk about as well in my panel on artificial intelligence and the ethics of artificial intelligence, is just this unbelievably important technical transition from artificial intelligence and technology that helps us understand ourselves and where we fit, which is really pretty much what we do with artificial intelligence right now. It just is a more efficient way to understand our own situation, and translating that into something like a predictive analysis, right? Something that can help us uh, feel the situation and when it changes. And it reminds me for all the world of, you know, uh, I happen to be having this podcast with the person that taught me this term, right? But the Fingerspitzengefühl of combat, right? The fingertip feel. It's a term from classic maneuver theory. It was the way the Germans talked about have a commander's sense of the battlefield during combined arms maneuver. And and in many ways, it's that fingertip feel that allows the commander to take her understanding of the battlefield and go from, okay, here's an outcome that we directed or that we were driving towards, but I think something important has changed, and that means I need to switch from pursuing an outcome sort of by rote and thinking in terms of, okay, what's the bet I need to make now? Right? How do I update my priors through my connection with data so that as my fingertip feel evolves, the decision, the goal, the process, drives all towards that. And that's something that I think these systems, the artificial intelligence systems and robotic systems that are going to be in our kill and protect chains, as the fungibility drives us towards efficiency, why would I buy 35 different kinds of missiles when I can buy one missile with a switchable warhead that can kill all kinds of targets? Well, the machine that's going to decide, hey, we're launching this missile against, in a protect mission, that means something for the ammunition that we choose. And the choice to go from a kill chain to a protect chain is it depends on that kind of sensory input that's technically just not feasible for artificial intelligence and robotics right now.
So that brings to mind a dialogue I used to have quite regularly, especially at the brigade command levels. I was working with company and field grade officers maturing into their responsibilities and developing into their future responsibilities. And that conversation was about being a scientist before being an artist. And by that, I mean, there are some basic premises, and we were in a striker brigade. So there's things like the range and time to arm a javelin missile vis-a-vis the movement rates of an enemy tank that create a science problem, in that you don't need to try and make it any more complex than it has to be. If you understand the basic science of the rates of fire of javelins versus the rates of fire and the rates of movement of a tank and things like that, you can map out using relatively straightforward arithmetic how fast that tank can close on you and the time it's going to take to arm, cool, and launch that missile, and then rearm and shoot another missile if you have a subsequent tank after that one, or you don't get a hit. And the realization that just came to mind for me, in that in the recollection of that experience, is that in some respects, certainly where we are now, and as you described the Fingerspitzengefühl, and thank you for the hat tip for the dialogues we've had over many years about that and other maneuver theories. In essence, the current state of play may, and I can't say this with complete certainty, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts and then also see how these panels play out. The current state of play of AI and robotics may lend itself solely towards the science of conflict. And that return to revisiting and applying the notion of Fingerspitzengefühl and the commander's responsibilities to understand and feel the battlefield, especially as we deal with unfeeling and purely logical systems like AI-enabled automation capabilities like robots. What's your take on this art versus science? I'm going to call it dichotomy at this point in time, and the role of machines, and both in terms of compute or AI and the actual automation itself.
Yeah, I think it's really important to start with understanding that the typical tagline, at least on sort of the current hype train on artificial intelligence, that if I have enough data and I have enough compute, I'm eventually going to solve all the world's problems. Um, I I think this pushes us. I think this pushes against that hype train a little bit. I should be clear. I consider myself an AI centrist, right? So there's the AI accelerantist who thinks that AI is going to solve all the problems. It's going to be great, and it's already here. There's the Luddites of the world, which have a respectable position as well, that kicking and screaming, you might say, into the 21st century and warning us all the time, the dangers. I just think we have some really, really powerful tools that are ev- ev- absolutely going to change the way we move in the world and those sorts of things. But there's a really important technological barrier to just thinking that, AI, the folks that work in AI like to speak of Luddites, right? Like the typical army solution is, hey, now I'm just going to rub some AI on it. In the 20th century, we were going to rub some leadership on it. In the 21st century, we're going to rub leadership and artificial intelligence on it. And I think for a lot of AI tech folks that I hear talk about, their version of that problem is, hey, we're just going to rub some compute on it, right? Like I'm just gonna go to gigatons of compute, and everything is gonna get sorted out. It may be true, I may be wrong, but I think some really smart people have highlighted a really fundamental problem in that the data that especially these large language models work on, isn't embodied in the way that our human cognition is embodied. There's lots of great stuff out there. I'd highly recommend folks check out a good friend of mine, Joe Chapa, wrote on this, on whether or not large language models understand. And essentially, the argument here is that they can't understand in the way that we do because they don't operate on the same data. And that's not a question of compute, right? It's a question of translation, and it's one of the things that I think is most interesting, and one of the things I would want to talk to somebody about at during the AI ethics panel is, how do we take these way more important, um, way more important conversations, both to the operational art, right? It's how we move from science to art, and in terms of our moral reasoning in combat, right? A lot of what makes us moral in combat, a lot of what makes it possible for us to make smart decisions, is the embodied nature of our cognition, right? It's we spend a lot of time thinking about whether or not artificial intelligence is conscious. And really what we're talking about here is, it's not only that it's not conscious, it's not even subconscious. right? Like our embodied cognition comes by way of our subconscious. The fact that I have suddenly realized that I'm now in threat after 12 months on a tank comes because my body has learned and adjusted my cognition to understand that the limits of my tank are now no longer in a safe position, right? And that just it's a technological barrier that takes some real work by engineers, philosophers, lawyers, uh, and the like to to figure out how we go about programming that data set into uh, into our artificial intelligence.
I really like that framework that you just applied, Bob. And I'm going to revisit what I said earlier about art versus science because using a linear or binary framework like that is a gross oversimplification. And based on this discussion thus far, my reframing personally is going to the DIKW triangle: data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And as we talk about Fingerspitzengefühl or the fingertip feel, and on that commanders and staff's intuitive understanding of what's occurring, I had a realization, at least in the current state of play and potentially well into the future, certainly in the pre-AGI, artificial generalized intelligence, the reality is the automated systems, the onboard compute, the AI, the autonomy that's embedded or semi-autonomous capabilities we plan are only going to take us so far. And I think we can map that out along DIKW. So they can handle the science of conflict. The tank can shoot X number of rounds per minute. It's got a probability of hit and a probability of kill of a certain level at a certain range based on environmental factors and crew training and things like that. But the reality is, I don't think that AI in the current state or in the near future state can really take us beyond perhaps the lowest level of the knowledge aspect of the DIKW. And so we can explicitly preserve the human aspect on taking that knowledge through the lens of experience or that cognition that you talked about, the metacognition, to then apply our wisdom and having the sources for that be as much the feel via the Fingerspitzengefühl as well as what the data is telling us and reconciling those two, especially if they're incongruent.
Yeah, I love that framework. I liked it best when I read it the first time. Most people, I forget the name of the psychologist that came up with DIKW. I
Adkoff, I
do,
believe, right?
yeah,
Adkoff's hierarchy.
I do know the philosopher who came up with it first. His name's Immanuel Kant, right? It is Immanuel Kant's picture of human cognition. If we need a whole nother podcast to geek out on how Immanuel Kant essentially painted human cognition before there were functional MRI machines, and it's not clear to me at all that fMRIs have shown anything in human cognition that Kant didn't write about in his first critique. You just have to be willing to read it, and fair enough, it's a big ask. But the but I think that triangle is just we talk a lot about OODA loops, we talk a lot about kill chains, we talk about pyramids that lead to wisdom, all of that, right? All we're talking about this same basic process of taking up data in a way that helps us connect with the world, make sense of it, understand our place within it, and then use that picture, that model that we build to determine our path to victory. I mean, that's essentially what I think the operational art requires, right? You have reconnaissance forces that put you in contact with the environment and with the enemy. Your PIR and your FFIR, right? Your enemy picture and your friendly picture help you understand, right, and build that Fingerspitzengefühl. And then it's the commander's job, right, when she feels like things have gone off the rails. Hey, it's time to change, right? It's time to go from, recon push to recon pull, right? Your crappy squadron executive officer jumped your talk to the other side of Mount Tiefert, and now you can't talk to anybody, right? Your Fingerspitzengefühl told you, right, that you had to move that you had to move the the forward command post. glad I provided you that opportunity to develop your first personal understanding of the battlefield. But it's that's what I think this, because the magic, as important I think as this first part of the problem is, it's really really important to get uh to get really clear on the stuff that AI is already good at, right? I don't want to throw cold water on, like, I think artificial intelligence can help me clear fires and clear my airspace way faster than any human ever could. And that's a really, really important problem. If you have suffered under the tyranny of trying to clear fires, right, you understand that if a bot can do it for me in 30 seconds, like, give it to me, please. But that's a very science-based thing in this metaphor that we're using. But understanding that even though I've got the clear airspace, now is not the time to put the helicopters in the air. Like, that's an entirely different set of data that isn't necessarily built by the same set of data that allows the AI to clear the battle space. And that, I think, is sort of the far frontier that I'm interested in talking about. And I think it's the thread that's going to run from, Rune Technologies talking about the importance of logistics. it you know as well as anybody that you often run into problems when you treat logistics like a science problem. You have to do the science, but then the AI is going to say that, hey, if we don't get some commodity to this island, they're not going to last. But we all know, yeah, they'll probably last, right? Like, yeah, they'll be okay if they don't have that commodity. We can assume some risk there. That risk calculus based off the logistics picture is something that I don't think is part of the data set that comes by way of any of these systems right now. Same is true of the C2 panel, right? Most everything that we talk about in terms of existing technology on the C2 panel is going to be getting really, really clear understanding of our own stuff, of our own data, and getting some of the drudgery out, the drudgery that involves the science of command out of human hands, so that humans can do what they're best at, which is this art, this finger spitch and Gefell that we're talking about. We're going to see it in the AI panel, right? The idea that if I can free up human cognition to focus on the right, the good, and the fitting, that's an enormous achievement. But when it comes time for these AI systems to help us determine and orient on the right, the good, and the fitting, there's a translation problem, and we're starting to ask these systems to do something that they just can't do yet. And short of an enormous project of philosophers, engineers, and lawyers getting together and figuring out what this data set needs to be, we just don't have it yet. And it doesn't come by way of natural language models.
And I think that's a perfect way to really set conditions for us to go ahead and wrap up this dialogue as well, Bob. Two of the panelists come to mind that are going to feed directly into what you've just described. First is what Smack Technologies is doing to automate strike operations, or the stages of that kill chain. Arguably a key element of that, and I'm really excited to hear what they talk about, is going to have to be the data set and the constraints that go into that automation. So in a manual process, we would have an attack guidance matrix, and that would tell us, here's how we're going to weaponeer against a particular target, the criteria under which we can strike it, where the delegation of authority to conduct that strike exists based on the criticality of striking that target and whatnot. A lot of different frameworks for doing that. But in a lot of respects, the decision to conduct that kinetic strike is pre-decided. And if you meet the conditions, and you can go ahead and basically automatically execute that strike via attack guidance matrix and your various fire support control measures. I don't know that the same framework necessarily exists in terms of automating the protect process, especially as we look at kind of that select and effect stage of the process, where it's a little uncomfortable to say the science says the criticality of defending this is lower than some threshold, and therefore we won't expend an effector, especially in this earlier stage where we don't necessarily have ubiquitous effectors, but we have discrete effectors for strike versus discrete effectors for protect. And potentially we'll reach that point where we have ubiquitous capabilities that can flip from strike to protect, and then give us a little bit more access and reach in that regard. But I think we're going to see some tough decisions that will lean more towards the art side as we develop the analog to the strike ops with the protect chain, such that that select and effect, there's the depth of capabilities on the effect side, and then the select part does not have to be as discriminatory in terms of whether or not you're going to affect, and then with what you'll affect as well. And we talked last time about the hypothetical Patriot battery that's protecting a village, a corps headquarters, an airfield, and a tank battalion. And then what is it going to fire to protect, and what won't it fire to protect, and how that's codified for organizations. But I think the other interesting piece is, as we look at the thread from, you already talked about Rune Technologies, and they're going to discuss how they can use AI to enable predictive logistics modeling to counter the tyranny of contested logistics in the future operating environment. And then we're going to see what companies like Smack and Dunedyne are doing to enable operational and tactical decision making with their AI tools. We'll have this ethics discussion with you. And then closing out the day will be Extractus. And as they talk about their cognitive models in the framework of when you're applying AI and you cannot have a decision tree that's not accountable or replicable, and you can't do some sort of forensics on the decision itself, and you cannot have hallucinations, whether it's based on the data or based on the model itself. So I think we're going to see a really interesting thread in terms of how AI is going to touch virtually every warfighting function and drive outcomes. Uh, so we can be faster on the science side, and then preserve that human cognition for the commanders and staff's role to apply their judgment and their wisdom.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it, Jay, and I'm especially excited about Extraxis presentation. I think one of the real opportunities, this is another thing that we're going to talk about on our panel, is that along with the obvious moral risks of artificial intelligence and robotics on the battlefield in terms of the moral risks around warfare, there's a lot of moral opportunity as well. And one thing we know, as our world becomes more enmeshed with data, it is just much harder to hide. And when things go wrong, that data points in the direction of the people responsible, and that's a really important thing in the moral universe of combat.
And interesting that we're going to sandwich between that panel you're going to lead and then the end panel with Extractus and everything you just described. The two panels between those are going to be equally valuable with our look at holistic health and fitness and preserving that human capacity to exercise that human judgment, the wisdom, and the cognition that you described. So how do we optimize the human's contribution to this fight going forward so that they can do uniquely what they can do? And then the other interesting discussion is going to be, and I'm going to dovetail with something you said much earlier. You talked about, can we have a more ubiquitous solution to strike and protect with the capabilities that are forward deployed? Can we tailor or configure warheads? Can we configure the delivery systems? Can we actively protect ourselves? And panel 4, which is going to showcase Bravo Ordnance, Advanced Material Development, Inc., Additive at Scale, and Aventra, is really going to talk about some of the early stage technologies that are highly configurable on the forward edge for both the platforms, some of the active ways we can protect ourselves, and how we can also configure those warheads against the delivery systems that can be either manufactured or configured on the forward edge. So it's going to be a really good thread between all this. And I'm looking forward to wrapping this up with you after AUSA when we can put this together.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And if anybody doubted what I just said about the eminent fungibility of these tools, it may be because you and I know the companies that are coming to Red Thread in conjunction with AUSA. it's a pretty powerful set of capabilities that these companies are bringing together. Um, and I think that's a great place to end it. You know, human cognition is embodied, and so the first and best way to think well is to live well and have a healthy body. And that's, I think, a really important conversation that we're tackling at Red Thread in conjunction with AUSA as well.
I love it, Bob. Thanks for tying this all together. And I'm so excited to get to see you in person here in just 2 short weeks and just to continue our discussions together. And I think this might have to become a podcast series that you and I maintain.
Hey man, I'm here for it. I found, if anybody noticed, I've upped my game a bit in terms of the studio, so happy to do it. Always love talking to you.
Yes. Well, and I'm glad to see that as a soldier for life, you're living selfless service and still contributing to the body of knowledge. So Don Snyder would be very proud.
Yeah, I need to find Don. I haven't talked to him in a while, but yeah, no, it's great, Jay.
Yeah. Well, it's part of being a professional. So, hey, Bob, thanks so much. And I hope you have a great rest of the night.
Thanks. You too, Jay.